Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You know the phrase by now. It's uttered by everyone, from politicians who are after your vote, to your fellow citizens suffering from sheer frustration, or even just comics looking for a laugh.
After 9 years of this prime minister, everything is broken. Everything's broken. Everything feels broken. Everything feels broken.
But when he says that Canada is broken, that's where we draw the line.
In the ERs that remain open, wait times have never been longer.
It may seem like there's a lot of places to shop in Canada, but all these stores are owned by just 3 big companies.
There's extreme partisanship and extreme polarization.
A new poll says that the majority of Canadians feel that Canada is broken. What? Just because the stock market is down, the railroad is on fire, and the Leafs lost to a Zamboni driver?
We're going to let Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre argue over if this country is entirely broken or not. But as we cover the news in Canada, it has become very clear to us here at The Big Story that some of the systems we rely on are faltering, to say the least. And rather than use that to try and grab some downloads or score a few political points, we thought we'd ask some of the smartest people in their respective fields a few simple questions. Starting with this: is it broken? If it is, how do we fix it? Welcome to Fixing Canada, a special series running all this week on The Big Story. Today, the final episode of our little project and perhaps the toughest fix yet: our polarized political climate. If you want to know why it is so hard to make progress on all the issues we've discussed over the past 4 days, this is a big part of that answer. It is impossible to come together to do big, difficult things when we're too busy lining up alongside our imagined teams and tossing insults at one another. How did we end up this way? Can we just blame the internet for it, or do we have to look in the mirror too? What can years of research into growing polarization show us that actually works? And assuming that we can find and implement policies that can help rein in the algorithms doing this to us, are we each ready to do our own part to bring down the temperature? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is the final episode of Fixing Canada: Polarization. Justin Ling is an investigative journalist who covers conspiracy theories and misinformation at Bug-Eyed and Shameless. He also authored a report for the Public Policy Forum about this very topic last year. Hey, Justin.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going very well. Thank you for finding a few minutes for us.
Absolutely.
If I asked you to point to a moment or an event when this country's political spectrum began to really break apart, what would you think of that?
I mean, I'd have to give you a bit of a cop-out answer, I guess, and tell you that it was really the advent of the internet. And it is a kind of useless point in time because, of course, the internet changed everything for good and for bad. And to be really honest with you, it's not as though the internet instantaneously altered our politics for the better or the worse, right? It's been a slow and gradual thing, and it hasn't just been, let's say, social media or Google or whatever. It has been the fundamental shift in how we talk to each other, how we get our news, how we finance our news, how we fundraise, how we pick stories as journalists, how parties pick issues, also how bad actors decide to, attack trust and attack each other, and also what we expect from both our media and our body politic and our politicians. So it's a real cop-out answer because I'm really saying everything is different because of the modern era and, big surprise there. But, I really think that is kind of the point where everything started unraveling.
I think that's a really good answer. And you mentioned, among many, many other things, that the internet changed, that it changed the way that we talk to each other. How does that contribute to where we find ourselves now as a country when we talk politics or talk anything that can be incendiary?
I'll do this exactly backwards, and I'll tell you how we talk to each other now, and we can sort of, maybe people can fill in the blanks and kind of work backwards from there. But there's been some really fantastic research done, a lot of it out of the University of Toronto by a political scientist by the name of Eric Merkley, who helped us with our report at the Public Policy Forum. And he basically observed this phenomenon called affective polarization. And affective polarization is an interesting thing because it's sort of the description of how we polarize ourselves and each other. So we often talk about polarization as though it's sort of this population-wide phenomenon that is an outside force acting upon us. But affective polarization sort of asks us to imagine how we do it ourselves. And what he found is that people are not necessarily rushing to the fringes on the ideological or policy matters, right? What they're often doing, and especially in the Canadian context, is that they are remaking themselves in the image of their political party. So what he found was there's actually not been a big shift on Canadians' opinions on, say, gay marriage. What there has been a shift is in people sorting themselves into agreeing with their party more and more and more. And that, in effect, is making their party more uniform overall. So, think back to the bygone era of when the NDP, for example, had a pro-gun caucus and had a couple members in their ranks who were pro-life and anti-gay marriage. Even the Reform Party used to have a couple members in their caucus in Parliament who were radically in favor of criminal justice reform, who thought that our prisons were too overcrowded, right? So you think back to these days when there was sort of a real heterodox membership, whether it's in Parliament or in the party ranks themselves. There was disagreements, often quite kind of visceral ones, inside the parties about where they stand. That is no longer really true. When is the last time you saw a big civil war in the Liberal Party on a question of ideology or policy? It's incredibly rare, and that's true across every single party. And that's largely because it is no longer sort of in fashion or encouraged to disagree with your party, because your party is on a mission.
Right.
And in that mission, you cannot dissent, because that would hobble your party's ability to win this mission and vanquish the enemy. And so the last piece of this is that when you become really ideologically lockstep with your party, you stop identifying or even recognizing members of the other parties, because you no longer have anything in common, because you are now, the Venn diagram no longer has any overlap between you and them. So, for example, this research has been done both in the US and Canada. For example, Democrats wildly overestimate how many evangelicals are in the Republican Party. Conservatives wildly overestimate how many LGBTQ members are in the NDP and Liberal parties, right? So you actually tend to come up with these caricatures of your political opponents because you no longer have anything in common with them. So this is affective polarization, right? This is how we become radically different from each other. And, to go back to the original question, which I've now strayed very far from, it affects how we talk to each other, right? It affects how we talk to our own kinfolk, but it affects how we talk to our political enemies. And it does in rather radical ways. We're now much less forgiving. We're much more severe. We are much more mission and quest-oriented as opposed to collaborative and compromising. So this is really different. We've never really been here to this degree before.
Do we have any way, you just mentioned a lot of good research, to track how this has been increasing at a population level, not just among the political class, but I guess, this is a huge cliche, but between an uncle and a niece at Thanksgiving dinner, who in the past may have been able to disagree and then, continue to just chat with the family. And now it's I'm not coming to dinner if he's going to be there, that kind of thing.
It's interesting because for our project, we tried to do a little polling on this, and we actually didn't find what you're describing. And I had a really hard time kind of squaring that. I think we found a little bit of it, right? Yes, there are people in this country who say that they do not want to have a friendship with somebody who's of the opposing political party. Yes, there are people who say they don't want to hear dissent or disagreement in their day-to-day lives. But we didn't hear a lot of it, and we didn't get the sense that it has risen significantly. So that kind of made me pause. And, it actually makes a lot of sense. Because if you start talking to people, I guarantee you, if you went out in the street and grabbed 100 people, 99 of them would say that they actually want to live in a country where that doesn't happen, right? They want to live in a country where you can agree, where you're not exiling people for their views.
Right.
But oftentimes when you start putting things into practice, things start breaking down. So I think what we're talking about is still an overwhelming feeling like we want to be able to reach across the aisle, but also a practical impossibility of actually doing it. And that's a really difficult problem to untangle. And I think it's one that we're going to have to think a lot about in the coming years, because the reality is there's still a ton of people in this country who will say, I believe that we have to use political action to make the country better, but also I don't want anyone involved in politics who doesn't support gay rights. And then you get to this point where you say, well, that doesn't really work. Those two things disagree with each other, right? Like, you need to be able to make space for people who have deep ideological differences from you. They cannot be excluded from our entire political project. Mm-hmm. They cannot be vanquished through the court of public opinion, right? They're going to exist. So how do you figure out how to make space for both of you? And as much as you might not like the idea of it, how do you find ways for you to agree on certain policy issues? And how do you figure out ways to make compromise on things where you do agree? And I think we have really strayed far away from those principles, and getting back there is going to be tough. And to go back to kind of my initial point, what makes it so tough is that we've lost a lot of our ability to sort of disentangle these social issues in the public realm, and are instead sort of fighting little skirmishes on the fringes and in online spaces that don't allow for a lot of collaboration or compromise.
How do we start getting back there? And, you just mentioned that if you went out and talked to 99 out of 100 people on the street, they would say you want to be able to agree, you want to be able to collaborate. How do we put that mindset, which clearly, I guess, exists among us when we meet each other in person and work together or sit down and chat? How do we put that back into our political spaces?
Yeah, so I guess I'll give you the sort of lofty, optimistic answer, and then I'll give you the real answer, which is significantly less lofty and optimistic.
Right.
And the optimistic piece of that is that there are ways to create fora where that happens, right? Like, for example, there's been this really great proposal from different groups and different kind of thinkers to have a sort of citizens' assembly on how to reform our political system, both our electoral process and some of our actual kind of mechanics of politics. And I think it's a really cool idea because it sort of envisions us getting into a room again, a whole bunch of us in different cities, maybe hundreds, if not thousands of people, filling up arenas full of people who each have a turn at the mic to talk about what they want to see in our political system and have the ability to do sort of citizen level voting. And this is not all that rare. Places that do this do tend to, not uniformly, not totally, but do kind of tend to have more of an ownership stake in their political process. A lot of towns in New Hampshire do local democracy this way. Switzerland does a lot of, plebiscites and referenda trying to get their citizens engaged on local and national issues. So I think there's sort of a logic behind the idea that if we are sort of drifting apart and having a hard time of getting around the table and agreeing on things, well, let's create the physical space to do that. So I think that's a really tangible way in which you can do something effective here. Now, I'll cast some skepticism on what I hear from some people, which is that all we need to do is find a way to, get at the table again, get talking again. But the reality is there's no way to do that on a national level all the time. There's no way to sort of force people to start debating politics and policies, especially in their busy kind of chaotic lives. It's just not practical to sort of reorient our society back to face-to-face conversations on hot button issues every single day. It's just not going to happen. So I think I'd also have to say there is no solution for this, right? Like, we can do some things that will help it kind of on an exceptional basis, but we don't have a lot of options on how to do it on a day-to-day basis. But, and here's the other big caveat, the caveat to my caveat, which is that the internet is not immovable, right? Like the internet has done all of this to us, and we have done it to ourselves via the internet. But the internet is a constant changing thing. The current iteration of what we have, where, Facebook and Google and Twitter kind of dominate our kind of political conversations, that's an unbelievably recent thing. We have made this the reality. We could just as easily unmake it the reality. There are ways in which we could opt for new systems or new platforms or new sites or whatever that would alter how we have those conversations. Ditto for how we get our news and how we fund our news, right? Our news is defunded. We have lost our ability to have a national conversation in the pages of our newspapers or on the broadcasts of our evening news because we've allowed Facebook and Google to systematically rig an ad market that has defunded our national media.
Right.
We could also change that. We could change that either by the decisions we make or the decisions our government makes, but it's going to require decisions, and we've thus far not made those decisions.
One of the things you just mentioned that I found really interesting was Switzerland and having lots of referendums and plebiscites. And I also think a lot about how many states last year in the U.S. after Roe v. Wade fell had their own abortion referendums and got them on the ballot, and how different those votes looked than straight party line voting. Is a potential solution to this in Canada, where we almost never have actual referendums on the ballot, to put certain issues on the ballot so that we realize how much more we have in common than differences, right? Like, again, abortion is suddenly now a political issue in Canada. If we had a referendum on abortion, I think both of us would probably feel comfortable in saying that, abortion would pass. Is this a way to detach the issues from party loyalty a bit?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think fundamentally, is it a solution? Yes. What's it a solution to? That's a much better question, right? Yes, it would give people more of an ownership stake in how their government makes decisions. But also, referenda are really only good for certain kind of clear issues. And, the two referenda we had in Quebec shows you how difficult it can be to even come up with a question about how you poll your population about big kind of significant changes. But I do think it would have the knock-on effect of improving trust in government. We want to give people this feeling like government is not a far-off and corrupted body, but one that you contribute to and can make better. So great. I think that's a really good policy goal. And I think it's one we should strive for. And, having a national referendum every year could be a great way to do that. But again, it will also be corrupted by the very things that are corrupting our current political system, right? Our inclination towards misinformation and conspiracy theories that are already corrupting debates on certain issues, and our politicians' willingness to engage in misinformation and conspiracy theories are also going to hurt our ability to have a national debate around the things we want to have votes on. So it sort of also toxicifies the entire process of this thing that could also be good. So we really have to solve for a lot of things at the exact same time. And fundamentally, I think a lot of it comes back to the question of trust, right? The reason people believe misinformation, the reason people fall for conspiracy theories, the reason people disengage from our political system and wind up hating everyone involved in it is because they don't trust it. Mm-hmm. They don't trust our government. They don't trust our media. In some cases, they've lost trust in our medical institutions, our banking sector, people have lost trust kind of across the board. And a lot of it's for a really good reason. A lot of it's kind of justified loss of trust. So I think really if we want to fix anything here, if we want to make everything kind of work again, you have to go back to that question of trust.
When we talk about the current state of the internet and how it breeds this kind of stuff, you mentioned that's a choice, and we could choose to go in a different direction. I guess I would ask you, if you picture that in your head, an internet that encourages trust, that helps to build it, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of different things there. And I think it's actually a really fun exercise that I would kind of encourage people to do at home, right? Like kind of sit there, close your eyes, and think of what would be a fun internet, for you. I mean, maybe you're imagining things that already exist and you wish were more popular or bigger or better run. Maybe you're imagining things that used to exist in the early days of the internet. Maybe, you're imagining browsing Netscape.
I miss AOL Online.
Yeah. I mean, I've been watching videos about some of the old internet and actually attempts to bring it back in some way, shape, or form. Going back to web rings, where you're no longer using search to find stuff, but you're using recommendations from people you follow online. I think that's a really interesting idea. I think it's useful to do this because the internet is fundamentally a collaborative process, right? It is bored nerds who fundamentally changed the internet, and it's multi-billion-dollar conglomerates who sort of keep it in place. The entire premise of a lot of internet companies was supposed to be move fast and break things. But it turns out that once they start earning billions of dollars, don't want you to break the thing they've made. But that's fundamentally what we need to think about doing. How do we break Facebook? How do we break Twitter? How do we break Google and replace it with something better? This is the destructive nature at the very foundation of the internet. And frankly, I don't think anyone's going to be crying tears when Facebook explodes or gets broken or when Google loses its ad monopoly. I don't think people are going to be crying over this. So what does that look like? There's internet services out there that are imagining a federated, sort of decentralized internet.
Mm-hmm.
Instagram's Threads is doing this. Mastodon is doing this as well. They're not quite as popular as bigger websites, but they may one day be. And it's going to require people using them and being excited about them and finding ways of using them for their own purposes that will sort of enable us to do that. And sort of the end goal of this, right? It's not just let's find a new place to post memes, although it can also be that. The end point of this is, can we figure out ways where we finance things better on the internet, where less money is being pocketed by multi-billion-dollar corporations? Advertising dollars that are being spent by your local car dealership are going more directly to your local newspaper, right? Like that should be a really optimistic goal we should have for this internet. An internet where you're more able to communicate directly with people in your community or who share your interests without going through a middleman algorithm designed by somebody who thinks that if they make you angry, you'll engage more, right? Like that's a really dangerous and bad thing that Facebook did for many, many years. And it absolutely toxicified our political discourse. There's this fantastic researcher by the name of Wendy Hui Kong Chung who worked on our report, who kind of patented this phrase that I absolutely love to describe this, which is agitated clusters of comforting rage that were developed by Facebook and other companies to keep us locked in these little bubbles where we were just mad at each other. And like, that wasn't productive. That wasn't useful. That didn't help anybody. All it did was kept us on the platforms longer, engaging more and earning more dollars for Mark Zuckerberg, right? Let's imagine a future where that's not the case.
You mentioned that this is already happening in certain smaller sectors of the internet. I mean, I will ask you for your personal experience with it, having gone from being a journalist employed full-time at a media outlet that was struggling. Not that it's that media outlet's fault, they're all struggling, but you left, you're freelancing, you launched a publication, which is, I assume, your intent to build a community away from the Twitters and Facebook of the world. Yeah. How different is the discourse?
It's night and day. Like, it's smaller. Like, I confess, I sort of miss the hustle and bustle and the kind of constant dopamine hits of checking Twitter every few minutes and getting new updates and getting new conversations and debates going. Like, that was, to my mind, a sort of golden era of the internet. But I look at Twitter now, like I've stopped using it. If you follow me there, I might post links, but I don't read anything. I don't engage with anybody because I look now, rarely when I do check it, people are just screaming at each other. People are just trying to win points for their political side. People are engaging with it as though you are, fighting a tiger in the Colosseum, not engaging with your fellow citizen to contribute to the body politic. And maybe I'm being a little bit Pollyanna about this. Maybe I'm being a little optimistic for a bygone era where we all engaged on public policy issues in good faith and had pleasant conversations. But come on, for a long time, that's what we did. Like, I think to watching Speaker's Corner on Much Music back in the day,
right,
and listening to people kind of give, not always, but often, sort of thoughtful and rational debates with each other. People like engaging. People like arguing, but also shaking hands at the end of it. And Twitter today doesn't offer that. It doesn't encourage that. It doesn't reward that. It only rewards blood sport and trying to take your opponent's eye out, Whereas, I look to somewhere like Mastodon. It's much quieter. There's less hustle and bustle. It's mostly nerds and gamers, but it's much more pleasant. And frankly, it's discouraged to be a real jerk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Ditto for a website like Blue Sky, which is one that's kind of built upon making a more user-friendly experience and giving you more control about what you see and kind of what the service feeds you. Threads, to some degrees, try to do this as well, although Threads is still beholden to Facebook's kind of constantly changing priorities, and I think we should be very skeptical of it. But on my own Substack, we have a comment section, and there's, a few dozen people, maybe a little over 100, who kind of either frequently or infrequently comment or reply or talk to each other, and it's unbelievably pleasant. If anyone ever jumps in with anything kind of mean or rude, everyone tells them to shut up and go away, right? Like, I think back to the early stages of the internet, where that was the status quo, where you engaged with people assuming the best of intent, even if you disagreed. And I think we do have to realize that there's nothing inherent about the internet that encourages cruelty or meanness or rudeness. It was both us having the freedom to engage anonymously and to let our kind of baser instincts come out, but it was also companies that decided and realized that they made more money when you were angry than they did when you were happy. So they did things that encouraged it. Mm-hmm. And I think the more we can reject that and get away with that, the happier we'll be, the more we'll find ourselves trusting each other and therefore institutions again. And the more we'll find that the kind of the things that used to work really well start working again. And I know this sounds really pie in the sky, borderline science fiction-y, but I don't think we all realize the degree to which this isn't natural where we're at right now. This has been the impact of billionaires making decisions for us without telling us, without us realizing.
Well, this is the last thing that I want to ask you, and I'm excited to do it because so many of the other intractable problems that we've covered this week need whole systems reformed, need governments to take decisive action, need billions of dollars in funding and policy. This may be the one issue we've covered where ordinary Canadians can make a difference with their behavior. So what should somebody who recognizes exactly what you're talking about when you say it's just people screaming at each other and making bad faith arguments, what do they do to improve that? Is it a matter of simply removing themselves from Twitter, or is it a matter of replying in a, kind Midwestern way? Like, what kind of impact can an ordinary person online have?
Well, let me start by saying that I really think it's critical that our governments wake the heck up and do some of this.
Yes. Because
it will be effective, right? And I've been actually kind of bleeding about this for a few weeks now, for a few months now. In the European Union, they are launching one of the most significant regulatory processes the world has ever seen to go after the services that have poisoned our discourse, bankrupted our news industry, and made a fundamentally unfair, uncompetitive, and oligopolistic online economy. That includes Amazon, Facebook, I think Twitter as well, TikTok, a handful of others. Fantastic. In the US, they're launching antitrust cases against Facebook and Google and others to break up the ad oligopoly that they've created that has bankrupted our services. Awesome. What has Canada done? We've taxed them and tried to regulate them into continuing to do what they're doing, right? Like, that is a fundamentally dumb idea.
We just want to cut in Canada.
Yeah, exactly. The Online News Act really just tries to capture through regulation the thing that's already happening that is deeply bad, that we need to discourage and stop, not regulate and continue, right? So I think it's really worth underlining that if we had a government that was more ambitious about this, it could help us remake the internet into something more constructive, productive, economical, and effective. But we don't have that, and that's really, really frustrating. But beyond that, like, there are things we can do, and there are things we should do, and they should start with things like get the heck off Facebook and Twitter if you can. Find other ways in which you can engage with people. Now, listen, there are people who are going to still use Facebook Marketplace, and maybe that's where your events are, maybe that's where your knitting circle meets.
Right.
Totally fine. I'm not saying that you're a bad person for using these services, but the more you can disengage with them, the more you can stop providing them profit, the happier we're all going to be. There are alternatives out there online, whether it's communities that are already existing that you can join, that are on services that aren't multi-billion-dollar companies that are existing to sort of strangle out innovation from the internet. But there's also places where you can make communities, right? I know a lot of people whose entire kind of online presence has moved to group chats, with 5 friends, 100 friends, 2,000 friends, whatever, whether that's on a Slack channel or WhatsApp or whatever. There's also kind of interest-oriented communities you can go be a part of. There's online gaming services that kind of provide a sense of community, not always in the most constructive way, but whatever, right? Like, what does that look like for you? I think it ultimately is a personal decision for people. And yeah, some of it is also just stop screaming at each other online. It sounds like, I think there was all these PSAs in the 90s. I vaguely remember them where, there was an attempt to get youth talking to each other online as though you were standing across the person, not thousands of miles away. But that's not a bad kind of thing to go back to, right? Like bringing civility back to the internet might sound a little doughy-eyed, but it's a pretty good idea, right? Considering how much of our political discourse now runs through the internet, realizing that it's a place to de-conflict and to disentangle disagreements instead of making them worse is a pretty good objective that really isn't so glassy-eyed when you think about it.
Justin, thank you so much for this. It's always a pleasure, and you're doing great work on this.
Thanks for having me.
That's Justin Ling, author of a report on polarization and a lot of great work at Bug-Eyed and Shameless. That was the big story. That was the end of Fixing Canada. We hope you enjoyed this little themed week. We loved putting it together for you. We hope it inspired you to think big about what we can do about the problems we're facing instead of who we can blame for them. That was really all we were hoping to do. If you have feedback for us, we'd love to hear it. You can email us. hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca is that email address. And you can call and leave a voicemail, 416-935-5935. Joe Fish is the lead producer of The Big Story. Robin Simon is also a producer here. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Diana Kay is our manager of business development. Mary Jubrin is our audience development lead. Sound design on this project was handled by Christopher Clark. I am your host and your executive producer, Jordan Heath Rawlings. Together, that makes all of us the Frequency Podcast Network. And yes, we are a division of Rogers. Thanks so much for listening. We have one more problem to solve for you on Sunday, so watch out for that. And we'll be back with a fresh big story on Monday. We'll talk then.